500 years ago, a Welsh exile with a very thin claim to the English throne won a battle he probably should have lost, and founded the most famous dynasty in English history. Henry Tudor was the last king of England to take his throne on the battlefield, and his marriage to Elizabeth of York, the daughter of his greatest enemy, stitched a fractured country back together after more than 30 years of civil war. In the last video, I went looking for the face of the White Princess, Elizabeth of York. Today, I want to shift our focus to the man lying beside her, her husband, King Henry VII. What did the founder of the Tudor dynasty really look like? Well, there's some good news. Unlike his wife, Henry left behind an unusually rich trail of material evidence. A portrait painted from life, a written description from someone who actually knew him, and best of all, a death mask. Hit those like and subscribe buttons for us, and let's go ahead and get started with a 5-minute history. Henry Tudor was born in January of 1457 at Pembroke Castle in Wales, with a destiny that was far from certain at birth. His father, Edmund Tudor, had died about 3 months before he was born, and his mother, Margaret Beaufort, was just 13 years old when she delivered him, nearly dying in the process. Henry's claim to the throne was famously fragile. It ran through his mother's family, the Beauforts, who descended from John of Gaunt, a son of Edward III, but a branch that had been born illegitimate, then later legitimized, and then formally barred again from the line of succession. The Tudors were a family who existed on the periphery of power, but on paper, Henry should have never come anywhere near the throne. The Wars of the Roses was the long and bloody struggle between the houses of Lancaster and York. It defined his entire youth, consuming the lives of his father and uncles. From the beginning of his life, little Henry was the family's best chance of regaining power. With no siblings to speak of, he was literally the Lancasters' last chance for the crown. I can't imagine the burden he had to carry throughout his youth, with the hopes of so many resting on his young shoulders. When the Lancaster forces were crushed at the battles of Barnet and Tewkesbury in 1471, the 14-year-old Henry was swept into exile, and he spent the next 14 years abroad, mostly in Brittany, living as a hunted man. Meanwhile, the York's tall, shining king, Edward IV, now occupied the throne. But things were certainly not rock solid for the Yorks in England. They were in their own mini-civil war after Edward IV died rather young, leaving the throne to his son, who mysteriously disappeared, and leaving Edward's brother Richard to become the next quite unpopular king. So you can see how, even in exile, Henry could see a way back. His enemies had turned on each other and were eating themselves alive. He knew he still had allies who would support him in England. On Christmas Day of 1483, Henry did something unprecedented. He gathered 400 rebels at St. Peter's Cathedral in Rennes, France, a group which included York men who hated Richard, some Lancastrian allies, and some European supporters like the Duchess of Brittany. He made an oath to return to England as its rightful monarch, overthrow Richard, and bring peace back to the land. One crucial promise he made on that day was to marry Edward IV's eldest daughter, Elizabeth of York. Together, they could join forces and hopefully broker peace in England. So in 1485, he landed in Wales with a small army and met Richard at the Battle of Bosworth Field. Against the odds, Richard was killed, and his crown, so the legend goes, was pulled from a hawthorn bush nearby and set on Henry's head right there on the field. His wedding to Elizabeth of York in 1486 united their houses, and the two former enemies somehow created a happy home, having many children together and, it seems, growing to genuinely love one another. Henry became an honestly talented ruler. He was very shrewd, and it was said that his keen mind missed nothing. Every detail of the realm and his family interested him. Where genuine descriptions of Elizabeth of York barely exist, Henry was described by a man who actually knew him, the Italian scholar Polidori Virgil, whom Henry commissioned to write a history of England. Writing around 1513, Virgil left us a portrait in words. He said the king was attractive and cheerful, lighting up when he spoke about his ideas for England. He had a sharp memory, loved to hunt, and loved to host events at his palaces. In his youth, he was slender but strong and taller than the average man of his time, with brownish red hair and dark blue eyes. However, as he aged, his once redeeming qualities seemed to imprison him. He grew reclusive, hunching over ledgers and agonizing over debts. His hair turned white and his teeth rotted away. The death of his wife Elizabeth in 1503 did nothing to help him. Henry was devastated, and the final years of his reign saw him grow paranoid and ill. He developed what was probably tuberculosis and died on April 21, 1509, after a long reign of almost 24 years. He was buried beside Elizabeth in the magnificent Lady Chapel at Westminster Abbey, in a chapel and tomb that he had conceived of and designed himself. So where can we go looking for his true face? Let's first talk about his painted portraiture. For Elizabeth, remember, every surviving portrait was a later copy of a lost original. But for Henry, we have something much more exciting, a portrait painted from life that we can date almost to the day. It hangs in the National Portrait Gallery in London as the oldest painting in their entire collection. According to the inscription, it was finished on the 29th of October, 1505, by an unknown Netherlandish artist. And we even know why it exists. 2 years after Elizabeth's death, Henry was looking for a second wife, and his agents were negotiating a possible match with Margaret of Savoy. The painting was ordered by Margaret's father and sent abroad so that the prospective bride could see what her suitor looked like. She turned him down, but she kept the painting, and we're very lucky that she did. Henry was about 48 when he sat for it. You can see it's definitely idealized. For a man of 48, he probably would have had more wrinkles and more age on his face. We can see carefully idealized eyebrows and lips, but it's still a wonderful painting, and curators regard it as the single most important image of Henry that survives. It became the prototype that later copyists reproduced again and again. Now let's talk about the effigy. We talked extensively in Elizabeth's video about this bronze sculpture. The effigies were sculpted by Pietro Torrigiano, who worked on them between 1512 and 1518, so several years after Henry's death. But it was certain that Henry had been a part of the planning process. His death, in contrast to his wife's, was expected. After his body was embalmed, a cast was taken directly from his face, and Torrigiano used that mask to build his images of the dead king, which included this bronze effigy and this very lifelike terracotta sculpture. And then there's the one object I'm most interested in, and that's the funeral effigy. When Henry died, a life-size image of him was built to lie on top of his coffin during the funeral procession. It would have been dressed in his robes, with a crown on its head, and have an orb and scepter in its hands. The whole figure would have stood around 6 feet tall, was built from wood and straw, and then covered in canvas and plaster. And its face was modeled from that same death mask. Today, only the head survives. Like Elizabeth's wooden effigy, it was a casualty of the Second World War, hidden in a flooded undercroft in a creepy pile of other effigy parts for years, before the Westminster curators could restore it. We can see real human quirks on his face. One eye is slightly lower than the other. There's determination and grit in the set of his jaw. We have extensive notes about this effigy thanks to Robert Howgrave Graham, the man responsible for cataloging some of Westminster's most astonishing treasures after World War II. He notes first that the nose of the figure was entirely destroyed and had to be rebuilt. So the Westminster team created a cast from the Torrigiano bronze and attached it to the face. But he notes that it looked entirely wrong. It didn't fit his face at all, being much longer and narrower than Henry's real nose. They ended up replicating the nose from the terracotta bust of Henry instead, although Howgrave Graham still said it looked unduly heavy. Graham also mentioned that Torrigiano missed the little dimple in Henry's chin that's present on the death mask and very slightly visible in the portrait. There were also real human hairs found stuck to the king's head, a mixture of bright red and gray. From the portraits, it doesn't really look like Henry had red hair. I do wonder if this is a case of varnish and wear darkening the images over time. But in Virgil's description, he did say his hair was reddish brown. This level of forensic assurance is not something we get for every figure from the past, so I'm extremely grateful for it. But for some reason, I'm left with a lot of questions. Why did Torrigiano omit or entirely change certain features of Henry's on his tomb? Did Henry order these changes, or were they accidents of artistry? Then it occurred to me just how masterful Henry Tudor's grasp of propaganda was during his reign. Because of his weak claim, he spun a lot of stories and legends to beef up his reputation. He started his reign by literally creating a logo for the Tudors, the red and white rose that's still a potent symbol today. In text, he constantly emphasized his divine right to rule, the fact that God allowed him to defeat Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth. He mythologizes the hawthorn bush he pulled the crown from. He commissions ballads to sing of his victory. Even his marriage bed with Elizabeth of York, which survived the years somehow, depicts the two of them as literally Adam and Eve, smiting evil and uniting together. The self-mythologizing was happening in real time. So is it possible that that's what he's doing with his facial features on his tomb as well? Could Henry's longer nose here be intentional? I can't help but feel that it's a subtle nod to the aquiline noses associated with the Romans, that it was meant to signal his leadership, power, and most of all, legitimacy. Let me know what you think of that theory. I couldn't find any information on it anywhere else, but it was just a question that stuck in my mind as I was doing all of this research. So with all of this together, a life portrait, a Renaissance bust, a written description, and above all, a death mask, this is about as good as it gets for my job. So let's see the face of Henry VII, rebuilt from his funeral effigy and death mask now. Since he died at the age of 52 from what was probably a long battle with tuberculosis, I did add a little bit of weight and health to his face here. Let's also see what he may have looked like young at the Battle of Bosworth. I've made a lot of Tudor recreations, so I thought it would be fun to put together a short family tree so you can see the resemblance between family members. Let me know in the comments who you think resembles each other the most. I see a stunning resemblance between Elizabeth of York and her granddaughter Elizabeth I. Plus, those redheaded genes are super strong. And let me know if a more extensive family tree is something you'd be interested in seeing. I really hope you all enjoyed this video, and we will see you for the next one.